The rain drummed against the church windows as I sat in the front pew, watching them lower my husband George into the ground. 43 years of marriage, and now I was alone with 200 acres of prime farmland and memories that stretched back decades. I could feel Derek's eyes boring into the back of my head. George's nephew sat 3 rows behind me, whispering to his wife Sandra about property values and inheritance laws. Even in grief, I recognized the predatory gleam in his expression, the same look he'd worn when George's father had passed away 15 years ago, leaving Derek nothing but bitter disappointment. The pastor's words about eternal rest and heavenly peace blurred together as I thought about the conversations that would inevitably come. Derek had been circling our farm like a vulture for months, asking pointed questions about George's health, our retirement plans, the condition of our equipment. He thought he was being subtle, but George and I had been watching him just as carefully. After the service, Derek approached with manufactured sympathy painted across his face. "Aunt Martha, I'm so sorry for your loss. Uncle George was a good man, but this is a lot for you to handle alone." I nodded politely, letting him think I was just another confused widow who didn't understand the weight of what lay ahead. But George had spent our final months together teaching me everything I needed to know about protecting what we'd built. 2 weeks later, we gathered in Attorney Mitchell's oak-paneled office for the reading of George's will. Derek sat forward eagerly, hands clasped, trying to look appropriately somber while his eyes gleamed with barely contained avarice. Mitchell cleared his throat and began reading the straightforward bequests: small amounts to friends, donations to charity, personal items distributed among family. Then came the part everyone was waiting for. "To my beloved wife Martha, I leave the entirety of Riverside Farm, including all buildings, equipment, livestock, and land, with one provision. Should Martha feel unable to manage the property alone, she may transfer ownership to Derek Williams for $1, provided he agrees to care for Martha for the remainder of her life." Derek's smile was predatory. He clearly viewed this as a mere formality. A confused old woman would surely hand over a multi-million-dollar farm within weeks of her husband's death. "There's one more thing," Mitchell added, producing a sealed envelope. "George left specific instructions that this letter be read only to Martha privately." As everyone filed out, I could hear Derek whispering urgently to Sandra about timelines and legal strategies. He had no idea that every word of that will had been carefully crafted by George and me together, setting the stage for what was to come. After the others left, Mitchell opened the sealed envelope, his eyebrows rising as he read. "Martha, George was quite specific. He says you know exactly what Derek is planning, and that you should let him think he's winning. There's also this." Mitchell handed me a smaller envelope marked, "For Martha's eyes only," and a set of keys I didn't recognize. "George established a trust fund that Derek knows nothing about. If Derek attempts to take the farm through coercion, certain arrangements will activate." I slipped both items into my purse, feeling their weight like tools of justice. George had always been methodical, planning 3 steps ahead of everyone else. Death hadn't changed that. Walking to my car, I saw Derek and Sandra conferring by their SUV. Derek kept glancing in my direction with calculating eyes. I made sure to walk slowly, shoulders slightly hunched, playing the part of the overwhelmed widow. The performance was about to begin, and Derek would be my unwitting star. Derek wasted no time. The next morning brought him to my door with coffee and pastries, wearing his most sympathetic expression. "Aunt Martha, I've been thinking about your situation. This farm is so isolated, and managing 200 acres alone." He gestured toward George's cornfields, already seeing dollar signs. I invited him in, letting my hands shake slightly as I poured coffee, my voice quavering when I mentioned feeling lost without George. Derek's eyes lit up like a predator scenting weakness. "Sandra and I have been talking," he continued, settling into George's favorite chair with uncomfortable familiarity. "We think we could really help you out here. I've got experience with large-scale farming, and Sandra's great with books. We could take this burden off your shoulders." Over the following weeks, Derek's visits became daily occurrences. He'd arrive with coffee, stay for lunch, and spend hours explaining why I'd be so much happier in a comfortable apartment in town. Sandra joined these sessions, commenting on how difficult the farmhouse must be to maintain, how lonely I must get. They worked me like a tag team, Derek focusing on financial impossibilities while Sandra played the emotional angle, talking about how George wouldn't want me to struggle alone. Each conversation was carefully designed to chip away at my resolve, to make surrender seem like the only logical option. I let them think their manipulation was working, playing my role perfectly while documenting every conversation, every false claim, every pressure tactic they employed. 3 weeks after the funeral, Derek arrived with news that made his eyes shine with excitement. "Martha, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but the harvester's broken down. Jim Martinez looked at it yesterday. Complete engine rebuild needed. We're talking $20,000 minimum." I let my face go pale, sinking into my chair with practiced despair. 20,000? Derek, I don't have that kind of money. "That's exactly what I've been trying to tell you," he said, reaching over to pat my hand with false sympathy. "These old machines are money pits, and harvest season is coming fast." He paused dramatically, as if struck by sudden inspiration. "There might be another option. I've got a buyer interested in that harvester, even broken. They'd pay $8,000 as is. That would give you breathing room, and I could arrange contractor harvest this year." What Derek didn't know was that George and I had rebuilt that harvester's engine just 2 years ago. The machine was in perfect condition, and I had every receipt to prove it. But I nodded gratefully and signed Derek's papers, watching him pocket the bill of sale with barely concealed satisfaction. He thought he was systematically stripping away my assets. In reality, he was providing documented evidence of fraud that would destroy him later. 2 days after Derek sold my perfectly functional harvester, he returned with Sandra and a folder of official-looking documents. "Martha, we need to talk," he said gravely. "I've been going over your finances, and it's worse than I thought." Sandra nodded with manufactured concern. "We've been losing sleep over this. We can't watch you lose everything George worked for." Derek spread papers across my kitchen table like a doctor delivering a terminal diagnosis. "Property taxes due in 3 months. Insurance premiums through the roof. Without that harvester, contractor fees will eat any profit from this year's harvest." The numbers were real but misleading. Derek had carefully omitted income sources and liquid assets that would have painted a completely different picture. "But we have a solution," Derek continued, his voice brightening with false hope. "We're prepared to take over the farm. Handle all debts, all expenses, everything." He slid the transfer document across the table. The deed that would sign over everything George and I had built. "Just like Uncle George's will said. $1 and we'll take care of you for life." Sandra squeezed my hand with practiced sympathy. "George would want you to be practical. He'd want you taken care of." I stared at the document, letting them think I was wrestling with the decision. In reality, I was savoring this moment, knowing exactly what was coming next. "I suppose you're right," I said finally, my voice small and defeated. "I can't manage this alone." Derek's triumph was almost palpable as I reached for the pen. My hand trembled genuinely as I signed away 43 years of marriage and 4 decades of work. Derek witnessed each signature with the thoroughness of someone who'd been planning this moment for months. "There," he said, sliding the completed documents into his folder. "You've made the right choice, Martha. George would be proud of how sensible you're being." The irony cut deep. George would indeed be proud, but not for the reasons Derek imagined. Sandra busied herself making tea, already mentally redecorating my kitchen while chattering about how much easier my life would be now. Derek produced additional documents, equipment titles, livestock registrations, mineral rights transfers. I signed everything he placed before me, the defeated widow who'd finally stopped fighting. Derek documented each signature with meticulous care, building what he thought was an ironclad legal foundation for his theft. As they prepared to leave, Derek delivered what he clearly considered the final blow. "Oh, Martha, I should mention, I've already got a buyer lined up. Development company interested in the land." The timing worked out perfectly. He walked away whistling, leaving me alone in the farmhouse that was supposedly no longer mine. But Derek's celebration was about to be very short-lived. Within days, Derek was hosting meetings with expensive suits who parked luxury cars beside my vegetable garden. I watched from my kitchen window as they walked property lines, discussing maximizing development potential and residential opportunities. Pinnacle Properties was offering Derek $2 million for land he'd acquired for $1. The development would transform our farmland into suburban housing, complete with shopping centers and chain restaurants. I made myself visible during these meetings, wandering around in gardening clothes, looking lost when surveyors asked me to move, playing the displaced farm wife who didn't understand what was happening to her home. Poor old thing, I heard one developer tell Derek. Devastating for her to see changes like this. But you're doing her a favor. She could never manage this place alone. Derek nodded sagely, playing the concerned nephew who'd saved the family farm from certain ruin. What he didn't mention was that I'd received nothing from the sale beyond basic housing and meals for life. I listened to him negotiate timelines and easements, already spending millions in his head. Sandra had started shopping for a mansion in town, and Derek had ordered a new luxury truck. They were so busy counting imaginary money that they never noticed me making my own phone calls, activating the second phase of George's carefully laid plan. On a crisp Thursday morning, a black sedan pulled into our driveway. Two men in conservative suits emerged, the kind of serious professionals who usually meant someone's world was about to change dramatically. Derek jogged over from the barn, confident smile faltering when he saw their expressions. "Mr. Derek Williams?" the taller man asked, consulting official documents. "That's me. What can I do for you?" "Attorney James Morrison from Morrison, Bradley and Associates. This is Mr. Chen from the Environmental Protection Agency. We're here regarding irregularities concerning this property." Derek's face cycled through confusion, concern, and growing panic. "What kind of irregularities?" Mr. Chen stepped forward with federal authority. "Sir, this property contains protected wetland habitat that was never disclosed in your recent ownership transfer. Development would require extensive environmental studies and federal permits, a process that typically takes years." I watched Derek's dreams crumble through my kitchen window, staying hidden but close enough to hear every devastating word. "That's impossible," Derek sputtered. "I've been over every inch of this land. There's no wetland here." "The wetland in question is seasonal," Morrison explained with legal precision. "Located in the northeast corner, where endangered salamanders breed each spring. Your development contract violates federal environmental protection laws." Derek looked like someone had just stolen his winning lottery ticket. "But I've already signed contracts. The buyers expect to break ground next month." "I'm afraid that's impossible," Chen replied with bureaucratic finality. "Any development requires minimum 2-year environmental review, assuming permits are granted at all." Derek had been so focused on dollar signs that he'd never done proper due diligence. But this environmental complication was only the beginning of his problems. As Derek stood frozen in our driveway, Morrison delivered the second devastating blow. "There's another matter, Mr. Williams. We've received fraud allegations regarding this property transfer, specifically that the previous owner was coerced through false claims about equipment condition and financial status." Derek's voice cracked. "That's ridiculous. My aunt signed willingly. She couldn't handle the farm alone." "According to our investigation," Morrison continued, consulting detailed notes, "the harvester you claimed was broken was actually in perfect condition. We have documentation proving the engine was completely rebuilt 2 years ago. Every receipt George had insisted we keep, every maintenance record he'd meticulously filed, now served as evidence of Derek's fraud. Furthermore," Morrison added, "financial records show Mrs. Williams was never in the dire straits you described. The farm's accounts were quite healthy at transfer time." Derek began backing toward his truck, panic replacing arrogance. "I was trying to help Martha. She was overwhelmed, confused." "Mr. Williams," Morrison said firmly, "I represent Mrs. Martha Williams, and she's prepared to file elder abuse and fraud charges unless this matter is resolved immediately." Derek spun to stare at my kitchen window where I stood watching, no longer bothering to hide. I gave him a little wave, the same friendly gesture I'd been offering while he thought he was manipulating me. "Mrs. Williams has been documenting every conversation, every pressure tactic, every false claim you've made for months," Morrison explained. Derek's jaw worked soundlessly as the scope of his situation became clear. The nephew who thought himself so clever was finally seeing the trap George and I had spent months constructing around him. Morrison reached into his briefcase for another document bearing official seals and stamps. "Mr. Williams, the transfer you believed gave you ownership was invalid from the moment you signed it." Derek's confusion was almost comical. "Invalid? But Martha signed everything. It's all legal, notarized." "Mrs. Williams did indeed sign a transfer document," Morrison agreed patiently. "However, she lacked legal authority to transfer this property." Derek looked between Morrison and me, his brain struggling to process this information. 3 months before Mr. George Williams passed away, he transferred ownership to the George and Martha Williams Family Trust. Mrs. Williams, while a beneficiary, was never authorized to transfer property to third parties. The color drained from Derek's face as understanding dawned. "Your signed document was worthless paper," Morrison explained. "You never owned this property, making your development contract null and void." Derek found his voice, though it emerged as barely a whisper. "But the lawyer, Mitchell, read the will." "Mr. Mitchell read the public will, detailing Mrs. Williams's trust benefits," Morrison corrected. "Trust documents were filed separately and privately, as is standard practice." Derek turned to stare at me with something approaching horror. "You knew. You knew the entire time." I stepped onto the porch, no longer the confused widow I'd been pretending to be. "George taught me about planning ahead, Derek. He also taught me about people like you." The trap had been perfect in its elegant simplicity. Derek's greed had blinded him to every warning sign that he was being systematically destroyed. Derek slumped against his truck as the full weight of his situation crushed down on him. But Morrison wasn't finished delivering devastating news. "There's the matter of the harvester, Mr. Williams, the one you fraudulently sold for $8,000. Derek's head snapped up. "I sold it legitimately. Martha signed the papers." "You sold it claiming $20,000 and needed repairs when the machine was perfectly functional," Morrison corrected. "That constitutes fraud." The buyer knew what they were getting. Morrison smiled with razor sharpness. "Actually, the buyer was acting on behalf of the trust. We've been monitoring your activities since before George Williams died." Derek's face went through several disturbing color changes. "You mean the trust bought back its own harvester for $8,000 while documenting your fraudulent repair claims? We now have grounds for criminal charges and civil damages." I remembered George planning this particular stroke of genius. He'd known Derek would try selling equipment piece by piece, and the harvester would be perfect bait to document Derek's fraudulent methods. "The trust seeks full restitution," Morrison continued relentlessly. $8,000 for the harvester, $20,000 in fraudulent damage claims, plus penalties for attempted elder abuse. Derek looked like a man watching his life savings disappear. "I don't have $28,000. "Actually, it's considerably more," Morrison said, consulting his notes. "There's also the Pinnacle Properties deposit you received illegally. Since you had no right to sell the property, those funds belong to the trust." Derek had received $50,000 when he signed with the developers, money he'd already spent on luxury purchases and Sandra's shopping sprees. "I want my farm back," I said quietly, speaking directly to Derek for the first time since this began. "And I want every stolen penny returned." Derek tried every desperate angle over the next hour. He pleaded family loyalty, claimed he'd been helping me, even suggested George would have wanted him to inherit the farm. But Morrison had documentation for everything, and the environmental findings had made development impossible regardless. "Here's what happens now," Morrison explained with clinical precision. "Mr. Williams returns the full $50,000 deposit to Pinnacle Properties, plus breach of contract penalties. He pays harvester fraud restitution to the trust, and he signs an agreement never to contact Mrs. Williams again, except through attorneys." Derek's hands shook as he reviewed settlement documents. "This will bankrupt me. The truck deposit, Sandra's spending, we don't have this money." "You should have considered that before attempting to rob a widow," I replied steadily. "George always said actions have consequences." Sandra arrived just as Derek was signing papers, arms full of shopping bags from her spending spree with stolen money. Her face when Morrison explained the situation was almost worth everything I'd endured. "But we already told everyone," Sandra wailed. "We put deposits on the townhouse. Derek bought the truck. I bought new furniture." "That's between you and your creditors," Morrison replied without sympathy. "The trust's only concern is recovering stolen assets and restoring Mrs. Williams' normal life." Derek finished signing with the defeated air of a man who'd gambled everything on a sure thing and lost catastrophically. As they loaded Sandra's purchases into the truck he'd now have to return, Derek turned back one final time. "You could have just said no from the beginning." "I could have," I agreed. "But then you wouldn't have learned anything about the consequences of greed." As they drove away in disgrace, Chen handed me the environmental report that had destroyed Derek's development dream. Reading it, I started laughing despite everything. The protected wetland Derek's buyers feared so much was real but seasonal, covering less than half an acre in the property's far corner. Completely manageable for farming, but enough regulatory nightmare to terrify developers. George had known about it for 15 years. That evening, I finally opened George's letter marked "For Martha's Eyes Only," saving it for when everything was finished. His careful handwriting filled 3 pages. "My dearest Martha, if you're reading this, Derek showed his true colors, and our plan worked perfectly. I've watched him circle like a vulture for 2 years, knowing the moment I died, he'd try stealing everything we built together. George's patience in planning Derek's downfall still amazed me. The environmental protection has been in place 15 years, but Derek never researched property records. The trust was established specifically to prevent his theft. Morrison has been our lawyer since 1998, waiting for this call." The letter continued with contingency plans for scenarios we'd never needed, backup strategies for problems that never materialized. George had spent months considering every possible angle Derek might use, preparing responses for all of them. I know pretending to be helpless wasn't easy, but Derek needed to believe he was smarter than everyone around him. His arrogance was always going to be his downfall. George concluded, "The farm is yours now, completely and legally. But I hope you'll keep it, Martha. It's not just land and buildings. It's proof that honest work and careful planning can defeat greed and manipulation every time." I folded the letter carefully, thinking about my husband's final gift. Not just the farm itself, but the knowledge that I was strong enough to protect what we'd built together. 3 months later, I stood where Derek had tried selling me his harvester story, watching Jim Martinez bring in our best corn crop in 5 years. The machine hummed perfectly, its rebuilt engine running like new. The development company had quietly withdrawn after environmental complications became public. Other developers heard the story and decided our area was too risky. The farmland would remain farmland, exactly as George and I had intended. Derek and Sandra declared bankruptcy, losing their deposits and selling everything to pay restitution and legal fees. They'd moved to Sandra's mother's house 3 counties away, where Derek now worked retail for a fraction of what he'd expected to inherit. I felt no guilt about their situation. George always said you can't cheat an honest person. Derek's downfall came from his own greed, not our trap. We'd simply given him enough rope to hang himself with his own choices. The harvest profits funded improvements I'd planned for years. New irrigation, updated storage buildings, solar panels for the farmhouse. At 72, I was more financially secure than ever and completely in control of my future. Sometimes I catch myself watching the road, half expecting Derek's truck with another scheme. But Morrison's restraining order was clear, and Derek had learned that underestimating me was an expensive mistake. The farm Derek thought he could steal for $1 was now worth more than ever, protected by legal structures he'd never understood and environmental restrictions he'd never researched. George's final gift wasn't just the land, but proof that I was strong enough to defend our legacy. As sunset painted the fields we'd worked for 4 decades, I raised my coffee cup toward the evening sky. "Well played, George," I whispered. "Well played indeed. Thank you for listening to this story of justice served and wisdom triumphing over greed. I hope it reminds you that patience and planning can defeat manipulation and avarice." Please let me know in the comments what part of the world you're listening from. I love hearing from listeners everywhere. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things when pushed too far. Until next time, remember that sometimes the best revenge is simply letting people reveal their true character through their own actions.